Thank you for attending this organized session, Clinical Documentation Best Practices. So if you think you're in osseointegration or you think you're in scoliosis, you're in the wrong room. If you think you want to improve your documentation, you're in the right place. So this section came about actually from feedback and comments from attendees from last year's Academy meeting in Chicago, and also just a general trend that an understanding that documentation in clinical practice is increasingly important. And so I was happy to partner with Ms. Stephanie Green to coordinate this organized session and bring some experts to share some information and best practices with you all. And I'm excited to let you know that we have Michael Hanno and Michelle Wolstein, who represent both CGS and Noridian, and they're going to share some best practices and some common errors from the regulator side and help us to do better in writing our clinical notes. So I'll be batting cleanup, and I'll be talking about the provider's perspective and some easy tips and tricks that I use to help us write better documentation. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Michael Hanno with CGS, and then at some point Michelle Wolstein from Noridian. Join me in welcoming them.
Thank you, Brian, Stephanie. We sure appreciate the opportunity to work with you folks today and everyone out here for this particular session. We're representing the DME Max Cert Task Force. We have representatives from the 4 DME Max here today. Michelle and I lost the straw poll, so that's why we're speaking instead of the other 2 ladies. Now, we're really glad to be here and looking forward to this. We want to talk a few minutes about cert errors. The cert contractor is kind of the watchdog for everyone. Their data analysis and their error rates kind of play a role. You know, snowball rolls downhill, so the cert finds errors on something and they'll tell CMS, then CMS will tell us, and then we'll tell y'all, basically. So I wanted to talk about a couple types of errors. These are going to be comprehensive because they affect every DME POS category. It's detailed written orders as well as delivery tickets. No matter the category, I don't care if it's canes, crutches, continuous passive motion devices, external breast prostheses, K3 lower limb prostheses, spinal orthoses, lower limb orthotics, upper limb orthotics, whatever the case might be, there are always errors with orders and delivery. They usually combine about 50% or more of the cert errors, just kind of a quick overview. These are all curable because you have complete and total control over these documents. So I want to just remind everyone, first of all, about Medicare's requirements for these 2 types of documents, and then talk about where the cert contractor is finding some errors. So from a detailed written order aspect, first of all, we need the beneficiary's name. We need to know who the item's for, the prescribing practitioner's name, the date of the order, the detailed description of the items. And this is actually expanded this past year to include either a narrative description of the item, a brand name, model number, the HCPCS code, or the HCPCS code description. So 4 avenues to get that detailed aspect of the order. And we need the physician's signature as well as their signature date. This can be handwritten or electronic from them. Anything that's provided on a recurring basis, and this also includes meds, not that we're going to talk about meds here today, but for like liners and socks and things along those lines. We also need some certain aspects of that detailed written order. We need to know what's being dispensed, the quantity to dispense, how frequent, and also the number of refills or how often that can be dispensed. I want to talk just for a second about the order date. If the physician gives you a script pad or something similar and it doesn't have all those details to it, like maybe it just says knee brace. Knee brace encompasses a lot of territory. You guys are aware of that. Well, that's going to be a dispensing order. It's a written dispensing order if the physician actually signs that document, like he or she fills out the little 3x5 script pad, takes it to the beneficiary, they come to your house. It's a verbal dispensing order if the doctor does not sign it. If the nurse faxes something over to you, if their office manager calls you, and then someone in your employment writes down that information, then they will sign and date it. It just means that some information came in to you to provide something for a beneficiary. If the physician completes a full, valid, detailed written order, from a DME MAC perspective, we're okay if it has one date. If they say on a prescription pad, a Crow walking boot versus ankle brace, that gives us enough information that would be considered a valid, detailed written order if all those other elements we just talked about are met. If someone other than the physician presents the detailed written order, and this is where your role comes into play, you can create and complete the detailed written order in its entirety, except for the physician's signature and signature date. So you get that script pad that says knee brace. You're going to meet with the patient, ascertain what's going to best fit their needs, make sure that everything's good on that side. You've checked eligibility, they haven't had one. You complete the detailed written order in your system, it prints out all nice and pretty, you fax the doctor, they sign and date it. Life is good. Now here's where the cert's finding problems with orders. It's not detailed. Suppliers are sending them a dispensing order, knee brace. Or even better, and we've seen this, brace. That doesn't really give us a lot of detail on what you're going to be providing. The item billed is not on the detailed written order, so the claim submitted to the Medicare program does not match what was on the order. The order was created after you delivered the orthotic. That's a no bueno. You have to have some type of order, at least a dispensing order, because you can provide the item based on a dispensing order. You just can't bill for it. So if no order was created until a week after you delivered the product, I promise you the cert contractor is going to catch that and call an error on it. The wrong beneficiary is on the order. It's supposed to be Mr. Jones, and the claim's for Mrs. Smith. Also wanted to make sure that you folks are aware that the cert contractor continues to find and call errors for the NPI on the claim form does not match the NPI of the physician who completed the order. So if there's a disconnect there, it probably comes from your billing company or your billing staff. But if you take a look at these, all of these errors, you can control them. Because if you create the detailed written order, you know who it's for, you know what it is, you know when you did it, all taken care of by you. The next document item I want to talk about is proof of delivery. Method one is direct to delivery. Means the beneficiary's coming into your storefront, you're working with them, providing the item to that beneficiary. There's certain information that must be on delivery documentation. Of course, we need their name, the delivery address. And we get a lot of questions about this. It's going to be the address where the item was provided or delivered. If they come into your store or your office, that's the delivery address. If you happen to take it to their home and fit them there, make sure everything's fine, they sign for it there, their home address is a delivery address. Now, I realize that most of your systems will have the option or the availability to have both your company address as well as the beneficiary's home address on the document. That's fine. But we do have to have the delivery address no matter where it takes place. Kind of like with the detailed written order, sufficiently detailed information to let us know what was provided. The quantity delivered. I know this seems like a no-brainer, but it's one of the elements that are required. The date delivered. and then the beneficiary signature or a designee signature. Now, please notice in that last bullet, we don't say anything about the beneficiary signature date. They don't have to date it. That's been removed. And we find a lot of errors where the beneficiary doesn't know the date, but they'll date the document. Your billing company, your billing staff go, oh yeah, it's the 17th, because they don't know the date. A lot of folks have actually removed the template date aspect so it's only the beneficiary signature. Because if there's a date on there and it can be pre-printed by you, that's perfectly fine. But if the beneficiary dates it by their signature, we're going to go by that date. So make sure that you're looking at that and they know what day it is. Anytime you provide something directly to the beneficiary like this, the date of service is going to be the date delivered. Top errors, no detailed aspects, so almost like a dispensing delivery ticket. Delivery was prior to the date of service bill of the Medicare program. Signature date and date of service don't match, kind of like what I was just talking about. No delivery address on the delivery documentation, and then quantity missing. Again, all errors that can be taken care of by you folks. These are all curable. So just a brief overview there. Now, turn our attention now. Michelle's going to talk about medical records and medical necessity for a couple of minutes. And then our goal is to have a few minutes before Stephanie starts speaking if you guys have a couple questions on the front end. So, Michelle?
All right, first off with our medical records and medical necessity. The biggest thing that we stress constantly is the importance of the LCD and the policy article. Both of those documents together give you a thorough picture of what the coverage criteria is for the item that's being dispensed and where that medical necessity comes into play within those medical records. So we cannot stress enough, do not just simply review the LCD information within our respective websites. The policy article also contains some very important information related to coverage and coding as well for those particular items. So I stress, review both of those documents for a complete picture of the coverage criteria information for those items. Now, for any item to be covered under Medicare, it does need to meet a benefit category definition. For your orthotics, that'll be the braces benefit category. For the prosthetics, that will be the prosthetics benefit category. And so we encourage you to refer to our respective supplier manuals for more information about those particular benefit categories. But essentially what you'll find is that the beneficiary must be meet that defined benefit category, how it defines those items within that particular benefit. Specifically for orthoses, that they are reasonable and necessary for the diagnosis or treatment of illness or injury to improve the functioning of a malformed body member, and that they meet all of those Medicare statutory and regulatory requirements beyond just the LCD and the policy article. It's all encompassing. There's a lot of information we understand that goes into meeting that medical necessity, verifying that coverage criteria, but it's just important that you realize that all of that information together is what paints that picture to show that the beneficiary truly needs that item, and therefore it will be likely considered coverage under the Medicare program. Now, another common reminder that we like to provide to the supplier community is in regards to the medical record. Now, the primary medical need for the item will come from that ordering practitioner, that physician that's sending you the order for the item. But there are other types of practitioners whose records can help you to corroborate that medical need. Again, help painting that picture, telling that beneficiary's story. So things like hospital records, nursing home records, test reports, PT or OT notes, things of that nature can all help provide some additional detail. Now, they won't necessarily be able to stand alone depending on the nature of those documents to support medical necessity in its entirety. But again, they can help corroborate and provide some additional detail that may potentially be missing from the referring physician's records if that is the case. So if you come up with a situation where you have those doctor's physician's notes and you think, oh, well, I wish it just had a little bit more detail maybe about ambulation or something like that, look and see if there's maybe some PT involvement with that patient's care. Those records might be able to provide that additional detail to show and support that medical necessity and meet that coverage criteria for that item. Now, when it comes to the actual documentation itself and what we're looking for, again, stressing the fact that it's all coming down to the medical necessity for that item. What is the medical condition that's warranting the need for that item? And so we need to be able to validate upon request all of that information in the event of a claim review. So we do not, as Medicare as a program, does not require you to obtain those medical records up front prior to delivery of the item. However, it's certainly a good idea if it's something you want to incorporate into your own business practices. It's something we encourage, but at this point, it's not a requirement. The benefit to doing that is that your staff can then review those medical records up front to determine whether or not the medical necessity is there, to determine whether or not that coverage criteria is met. And with that information, they can make a determination as to whether or not an advanced beneficiary notice of non-coverage might be appropriate in that particular situation. Without those medical records, it's hard to make that determination prior to delivery. So again, not a requirement, but certainly in your best interest to get it. At the very least, you need to have access to those medical records in the event of a claim review or an appeal if the situation warrants it. Now here is some indications of some of the types of things that we look for within the medical record to substantiate the medical need for various items. Not going to be all encompassing, and it'll vary depending on the particular item being ordered and dispensed. But for example, some things we might be looking for is frequency of use, diagnosis. Something I want to stress with the diagnosis is that diagnosis alone will not always completely verify or confirm medical necessity for an item. There are some policies that do have some diagnosis criteria, but it is in addition to other criteria as well. So just because a beneficiary has a valid diagnosis code documented in their medical record and it's submitted on the claim does not guarantee that that coverage criteria is met. So be mindful of that, making sure that not just the diagnosis, but all applicable coverage criteria is met and documented. Duration of the condition, clinical course, prognosis, functional limitations, past experience of any related items that they may have used. One thing that we all like to stress quite frequently is that our nurses that are reviewing these claims, they do not have the luxury or the ability to meet and interact and assess these patients for themselves. They have to make their determinations based solely on what's in those medical records. And that's where the level of detail is so important. A phrase that came up in discussion at our exhibit booth this week was, it's not necessarily about quantity, it's about quality of the medical records. So making sure that information is thorough and truly justifies the medical need for the item so that our nurses can truly see where that need lies and warrants the need for the item. Now, another thing we want to stress is that any supplier-produced records, any records that you create and maybe the physician co-signs or something like that and reviews on their own, those cannot stand alone as medical records to support medical need. And so it's important that it's those physician notes that are utilized to support the medical necessity for an item. And that also includes things like orders. A frequent question we get is, if we make sure that the diagnosis code is on the order, is that sufficient for medical necessity? Well, the answer is no. If they want to put it on there, if you want to require it, that's perfectly fine. Medicare does not require the diagnosis code on the order, but that alone, the order alone, the CMN, DIF, whatever you might be utilizing as an order, that alone does not justify medical necessity. It comes down to what's in those medical records. Now here we have just a brief overview of some of the top cert errors that we're currently seeing with the lower limb orthotics, so things like your AFOs and your knee orthoses and things of that nature. First off, no documentation of customization or modification from the CPO's records concerning off-the-shelf versus custom fitting. This is something, the off-the-shelf and the custom fit codes, those prefabricated codes were split out about 4 years ago. And the unique aspect of those codes, because they're both prefabricated, the determination of which code to bill on the claim comes down at the time of delivery based on the nature of those modifications and adjustments. So it's important that as the supplier who is dispensing the item, you document in your own records what exactly was adjusted or modified to support the fact that that customization, that custom fitting actually took place and that the beneficiary could not have accomplished that on their own. So just again, making sure that your own records are detailed when and if those modifications or adjustments are necessary. Because again, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. That's kind of our rule of thumb. If it's not in the records, then we can't and you can't prove that it actually happened. Another common error is that the medical records do not support the need for the orthosis. Again, just coming back to that coverage criteria and the medical justification within the physician's notes for the item that's being ordered and dispensed. No medical documentation of knee instability, joint laxity, recent injury, or surgical procedure where an orthotic would be medically necessary for the beneficiary. That's specifically referring to the knee orthosis LCD and policy article. There are very specific coverage criteria requirements concerning how to document knee instability to meet that criteria, as well as whether or not the beneficiary has had a recent injury or surgical procedure. So again, if you are able to implement some sort of a process to require those records up front, I encourage you to do so. That way you can review those records yourself to determine whether or not those aspects of the coverage criteria have been thoroughly documented. No clinical documentation received at all. So this would likely be a circumstance where the records upon request for review were in fact submitted, but you submitted your supplier documentation, you submitted the proof of delivery, the order, but you didn't produce any sort of medical records from the ordering physician. And although we do encourage you to send whatever records you have, obviously those physician records are particularly important for the medical necessity aspect. And lastly, for this category, no documentation to support the need to replace the orthotic billed to Medicare. And this is something we see quite frequently, particularly with the orthotics, in that that same and similar criteria is coming into play if it wasn't checked within the intake process or it was missed within that intake process, and you go ahead and provide and bill for the item, and it turns out that the beneficiary has received one within that reasonable useful lifetime for that item. So it's about asking the right questions, sometimes asking a question multiple different ways, utilizing the resources that you have at your disposal to check that same and similar information to prevent errors of this nature. Next, the top cert errors for the lower limb prosthetics. Missing medical record documentation of the need for replacement of a prosthetic limb or major components of the prosthetic device. Now, this is another one of those policies that's kind of unique when it comes to its replacement criteria. So again, I strongly encourage you to refer to the lower limb prosthetic LCD and policy article for those very unique and specific replacement criteria, and just making sure that the documentation fully supports the fact that either the entire limb or a specific component does in fact need to be replaced, and why. Again, that documentation needs to be detailed. If it's not detailed, you can't prove that need for that replacement. No medical records to outline the functional level prior to amputation or the potential functional level after the amputation of the lower limb. And this is another unique aspect of this policy, in that it's very specific that the physician be the one that documents the functional abilities or potential functional abilities of the amputee. Now, the functional ability can be corroborated by the CPO, but ultimately the physician does need to document those abilities within their own records. No documentation from the CPO's clinical record. This is an error that is 100% preventable on your behalf. When those records are requested, although that medical necessity is needed in the physician's records, your records are still important to corroborate that information, especially when it comes to justifying the type of componentry that's necessary. So make sure whenever documentation is requested for a review or you're pursuing one of the levels of appeals, always include your documentation in your notes as well. And last but not least, medical records were illegible. This is a surprisingly common error that we see in regards to not being able to read those records. And the general rule of thumb that we advise suppliers of is if you can't read it, we probably can't read it either. I've actually personally seen nurses within our company all huddled around a cubicle, blowing up their screens as big as they possibly can in an effort to try to read and understand documents that have been received. So please make every effort to try to obtain legible records. If you need to go back to the physician for clarification on what they say, whatever it takes, please do your best, whatever you can within your abilities to provide us with legible documentation. At this time, we're going to go ahead and take just a few minutes for questions for Michael and myself concerning the Medicare requirements for documentation. So if you would like to ask a question, we ask that you stand up and approach one of the microphones, and we will do our best to address your questions.
Oh, never mind.
Great. Is this on? So I have a question.
Oh.
First of all, thank you for coming and sharing some of the high audit reasons and giving us some recommendations to solve them. This one's a little more technical. So in our practices, we frequently are working with academic health centers with fellowships, and oftentimes the dispensing order comes from a fellow who's treating the patient working under an attending physician. It's a generic dispensing order, leg brace. Fellow writes a very simple order, and they say send it to CPO XYZ, and when we create a detailed written order, fax it back to the practice, the fellow has rotated off. They're there every Tuesday for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and the attending receives it, signs it, sends it back. Would that cause an error if audited?
Now, we can't actually speak, although we are sharing cert errors and things of that nature here today, we can't actually speak on behalf of the cert contractors in regards to how they would review in those types of situations. We can only speak to how the DME Max would actually review, and speaking independently of our own DME Max. From a Noridian perspective, and I'll let Michael weigh in from CGS as well, typically when we're verifying the MPI billed on the claim for the referring practitioner versus who has ordered the item, we're looking at the detailed written order, not so much the dispensing order. We might verify that they are under the same practice or there's that relationship happening, but more often than not, we are comparing the detailed written order, or the name and the MPI on the detailed written order, to what's on the claim. We aren't comparing so much the dispensing order. So a situation like that typically would be perfectly fine.
Thank you.
Michael, did you have anything to add? Or you can join me here, we can share.
Just a suggestion, would treat that dispensing order as a verbal dispensing order and have someone from your staff go ahead and sign and date it, since the physician did not actually sign that dispensing order. And that might help alleviate any possible errors down the road.
Thank you.
My question would be about the functional level requirements for prosthetics. Has that changed since our records are now considered medical?
You know, I realize that there was a recent law passed concerning your CPO records. At this time, the DME Max have not received any sort of formal direction from CMS in regards to how we will be reviewing or viewing those records in our claim review. So we can at this time, unfortunately, speak to how and if any of that has changed.
And it's sufficient to just have it on the detailed written order that the functional level is and physician signature.
What we encourage when it comes to documenting the functional abilities or the potential functional abilities for a beneficiary is that the physician is documenting narratively within their records what those abilities are. We don't expect the physician to know numerically that they're a K3 ambulator. But we do expect them to explain, maybe they have occupational requirements, maybe they're a construction worker, and those are things they can document and they should be documented. It's about having a conversation with their patient about what their needs are concerning their ambulation. I know some of you scoff at that and laugh a little bit because I realize it's hard to get those physicians to understand the importance of those aspects of the medical records when it comes to ambulation. And there again, it's about you having those conversations with your referral sources and just saying, hey, you don't have to tell me in your notes what that functional level is, but you do need to explain where those beneficiaries' needs lie.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, taking off of that concerning review of your CPO records and the recent law being passed, you can rest assured that as soon as we do get that formal direction from CMS, you will see information pertaining to that coming out in our respective listservs from both CGS and Noridian. So if you aren't signed up for our listservs, we strongly encourage you to do so you can get that information as soon as it's made available.
And just a general comment, I mean, that announcement was a little over a week or 2 weeks ago, so we understand the government and contractors don't work all that quick. So that's what's exciting about today's session is it's in real time, right?
Very
now.
much real time,
Great.
yes.
Great.
Next question.
The problem I'm experiencing lately, and it's getting worse, is that the physician's printed document of the progress note is from a software they're very automated. And the software contains all the necessary facts for them to get paid. But for us, it doesn't have any fields for us to put the kind of information that you're requesting into that document. And once, unless you follow the patient into that actual clinical setting, the doctor will look at you and say, I don't know where to put this. So is it possible for us to create a document and have the physician sign it and that has what you require and then say, okay, put this in your record, just make sure it's in there? Is that good enough, or does it have to be the printed progress note that contains everything you want?
Ideally, it really does have to be those physicians' original progress notes and things of that nature. Remember, if you recall me commenting on the fact that any supplier-created documentation, unfortunately, would not be used to stand alone in supporting the coverage criteria and the medical necessity. If there's additional information, if it's clarifying or providing additional detail, it may potentially be able to be used for corroborating purposes, but it unfortunately would not stand alone to meet the medical necessity.
Are you working with the software creators and the physician, the specialties? Because as a practitioner, I'm dealing with general practitioners, orthopedists, vascular doctors. So far, the best notes I get are from physiatrists, but all the other ones, the notes are terrible, and we don't even know where to start most of the time. And they don't know how to help us, even if they want to or don't.
From the DME MAC perspective, and Michael, you can speak to CGS as well, we are not personally working with any sort of programmers or software vendors concerning maybe templated notes or things of that nature. I can't speak to whether or not CMS is doing that at this point. I know at one point they were holding some open forums, kind of initiating discussion within the industry concerning templated documentation specifically for lower limb prosthetics. I'm not sure where they're at with that or if that's still something that's in process, but it has been a topic of conversation. I just can't speak to where they're at within that process at this time. Michael, do you have anything to add?
I haven't heard anything either. As far as I know, they're still reviewing the possibility of a template from a CMS perspective.
Unfortunately, it becomes a dead end for us, and there's no way to solve it. We can't provide the information, and the doctor can't. I'll go sit down.
No, we understand, and we thank you for that feedback. 2 more? Okay. We can take 2 more questions. Go ahead in the back there.
I have 3 questions. Do I leave one out?
How about there's a gentleman behind you. We'll let you ask 1 question, and we'll let him ask 1, and if you've got additional questions, we might be able to catch you afterwards.
Does the proof of delivery need to include the stock number or serial number?
That would depend on the nature of the description that you're utilizing on the proof of delivery. As long as the information that you're using, whether it's a narrative description or manufacturer name, model number, serial number, things like that, so that we can clearly identify the item provided, as long as whatever you're using is detailed and sufficient so we can identify that item, that would be satisfactory, but it really would depend on what you're utilizing. Serial number is helpful and encouraged. It just depends on the item that you're providing and what method you're used to describe it.
For instance, if you're delivering in custom unload or knee orthosis, does that need to include that and or the serial number of a prosthetic foot?
That's one of the complicated things when you're talking about custom fabrication and things like that, because a lot of times it's the descriptions, or at least the HCPCS code description, is somewhat vague because that custom fabrication is unique to that patient. So in that situation, we certainly encourage using narrative descriptions to identify the customization that was done for that beneficiary to describe the item, but using as much information as you can so we can clearly identify what was provided. Michael, do you have anything to add?
I agree completely, Michelle.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question, sir.
Could you possibly speak to some specifics associated with the post-billing audit that's automatic with MPKs, and any timeline or guidelines you have procedurally and what we can expect on our side for that procedure to be conducted? Do y'all have a policy guideline on days and so forth?
So you said the post-pay audits. Are you talking about from like CERT and the racks and things of that nature?
I'm speaking specifically to the MPK post-billing prepayment audit that's automatic for MPKs.
So the types of reviews that the MACs are currently conducting are called TPE reviews, Targeted Probe and Educate. And it's a kind of a change to how we were previously conducting reviews with the widespread reviews that were happening. And this change just came about this past year for all 4 jurisdictions. And they are specifically prepayment reviews. And they are primarily supplier or policy targeted. So through data analysis that we're conducting internally, a particular product or supplier might be identified as maybe needing some additional education concerning the claim submission for those items. So we'll reach out to you individually and offer you the opportunity to participate in the TPE review. And through that, a series of potentially 3 rounds of reviews will happen one-on-one with that supplier between one of our medical review nurses and the supplier themselves. And through that claim submission, we will review those individual claims, and the nurse will provide one-on-one feedback concerning that review regarding what it is that they are requesting and looking for those items. And if she is put in a position where she does have to deny the claim, again, she'll provide that direct feedback concerning what exactly the issue was and what can be done in the future to prevent it, or what can be done at that point to resolve it and maybe see a favorable outcome at the redetermination level. So again, it's going to vary depending on the item in regards to what exactly they're looking for, but the nurses will walk through that with you in the event that you're included in that review to tell you exactly the pieces of documentation they're looking for. They'll provide some education and training concerning what they're looking for in the medical records to justify the coverage criteria for those items. And it's really a wonderful opportunity for you to get that one-on-one education and walk you through those review processes so that ultimately you can be successful, because that's what we want out of these TPE reviews, is for you to be successful and to get paid. And so that's kind of how we're conducting reviews at this time amongst all 4 DME MACs. Michael, do you have anything to add concerning CGS and how they're conducting their TPEs? We do.
Both contractors, or all 4 jurisdictions, have a webpage regarding Targeted Probe and Educate. With CGS, it's within the medical review section of our website. And same with the Noridian. And I just want to reiterate very quickly what Michelle said. These are supplier specific, so the days of the widespread prepay reviews for different HCPCS codes are gone. We're using data analysis to look at suppliers with aberrations in billing or other issues against peers, and the medical review clinicians are reaching out to those suppliers one-on-one. So no more of the widespread prepays. And I've got some handouts up here regarding TPE, the Targeted Probe and Educate. If you guys want to take a look at that afterwards, I'll be more than happy to leave them for y'all.
Well, I guess it's still morning time. Good morning. My name is Stephanie Morgan Green, and I work with Brian at Ability Prosthetics and Orthotics as their compliance officer. And some of you may also know me from my work with OSER as my consulting company called the Audit Team, where we help you review documentation and give you input on whether our set of eyes thinks you've met all of the requirements of the LCD and the articles, and help you through some of those struggles with getting physician documentation. So today, I'm here to kind of talk about documentation in a little different light. I hear a lot of frustration from practitioners saying to me, how does an insurance company get to decide what medical treatment a patient should have? How does an insurance company believe that they should be able to decide medical treatment above and beyond what the physician says? If the physician ordered it, whose place is it at the insurance company to say that it's not needed? So I want to take a few minutes today and kind of set the stage of what it really is that the insurance company is looking at and how that interplays with the medical decision. And then Brian is going to be nice enough to talk about really how to get that information into the medical records. But the first thing I think is very important to understand is there's a difference between medical judgment, medical treatment judgment, and medical necessity coverage criteria. Insurance companies have a contract of insurance between themselves and the patient. And that contract, that's exactly what it is a contract, says if you want us as the insurance company to pay for this item, these are the steps you have to take for us to be legally obligated to pay for it. Technically, the insurance company is not making decisions on whether the treatment is medically needed or medically appropriate. They're making the decision on whether you've met your contractual obligations for them to have to pay for it. So they're not making medical treatment decisions. Now, why I say all of that, I completely understand in today's world, if an insurance company isn't going to pay for something, especially something like a lower limb prosthesis, there's a good chance that the patient's not going to be able to afford to pay for it themselves. But we still need to take a step back and realize that we're not fighting over medical decisions and medical treatment decisions. We're talking about how we explain why we made that decision. And if we explain why we made that decision appropriately in enough detail, we almost always then meet our coverage criteria, that contract language that says if you do these 5 things, we'll pay for it. So again, I think instead of sometimes fighting it from how can they tell me the patient doesn't need this, to taking a step back and saying, okay, under the contract to get that patient their coverage, what do we need to document? How do we need to explain it? And explain that decision that's already been made. So the meanings are different, but they actually work together. If the physician will document the why behind his decision, I guarantee you, you're not going to have that much of a struggle to get it covered. Almost every medical policy from an insurer is based upon giving the facts behind the why, giving that why. Our problem is, as an industry, with the relationship we have with our referring physicians, a lot of times they just want to put the decision. They want to say, this is what I want you to do, and that's what they've written in the medical record. They don't tell us the why to that decision. If they tell us the why, give those facts behind the why, then those two, decision-making and coverage policy, they're not at odds anymore. They actually work together. And so that's what we have to think about, is that we need to change the mindset of our physicians, and I know that's a big statement, and I know I'll probably get a lot of people rolling their eyes at me, but that's really where it comes down to, is as we move forward, we need to get our physicians to understand that they have to explain how they reached the decision, why they reached the decision, not just the decision itself. So these are typical things I see in a medical record, and I'm sure probably the representatives of the DMX would say that they see the same thing, where the only thing the physician documents is the date of the amputation, and then they'll literally quote, word for word, the K-level definition, right? And they'll say, give a prosthesis, and that's what they hand to you guys. And I get people all the time say to me, well, it says he has an amputation, and it says that he's K3, we've met the requirements, right? the simple fact is we haven't met the requirements. And as they were demonstrating, some of the top errors, and I took this more from a DME MAC perspective, errors from your websites, since I knew that they were talking about the cert errors. But from the DME MAC's perspective, some of the top errors of the documentation does not support the functional level build. And the concept is that they need to know why and how the physician drew the conclusion that they're a K3. And quite frankly, I tell people all the time, you don't need the physician to say K3. They don't ever have to put a K level in their medical records. It's all about explaining what the patient did before amputation and what the patient is expected to do after amputation. What are those activities? Paint the picture. You'll hear me, if you interact with me at all, you're going to hear me say that again and again. Paint the picture. And actually, I can pull out numerous examples from appeal denials, where especially C2C Solutions likes to use the phrase, the medical records did not paint the picture of the patient's condition. And that's what we need. We need that explanation. So what type of explanation? If you look at the LCD, it actually tells you the types of facts they want to know about. They tells you who needs to include that information and what type of information they're looking for. So I kind of look at things as two different things. We have the base need for a prosthesis, and then we have the individual components. And if you look at the base need for the prosthesis, the LCD has the word "and" in there. The physician and the prosthetist have to describe this underlying need for the prosthesis. And what kind of facts you're supposed to look at. What kind of story are they looking for? They want to know about the past history. What did the patient do before the amputation? They want to know about their current abilities. What are their current issues and what are they expected to do? And quite frankly, a lot of times this is what they used to do, and we expect them to return to that. If they have a proper prosthesis, they're going to be able to go back to doing what they used to do. And of course, to make sure that the patient is on board with this and actually wants to use the prosthesis. So the LCD shows that they're looking for the physician and you to paint the picture of the story, tell that story of the patient. But when it gets to the actual components, you guys can do it. While the physician can too, the physician can put all of the information in on the componentry, but the LCD allows you guys to step in and give more information on the componentry because there's an and/or. So this is where you get to say, the physician expects the patient to do this activity. To be able to do this activity, I need to use this component. This component will support the patient to do the activity the physician expects the patient to be able to reach. So you guys can work as a team between the physician and your own notes to take those baseline activities and explain why, because of those activities, you're choosing the specific knee, the specific foot. If you're adding, adjustable pylons, all different things like that, ultralight materials, you get to explain and give the details to why you're choosing all that componentry. So I like to put some FAQs in here because as much as I would love you guys to walk out of here and say, well, Stephanie said X, Y, and Z, I know my name is not going to do harm. Maybe Michael will consider it a little bit, but no one else really will. So I try to put FAQs in here to support it. And like right here, I tell people all the time, don't worry about the physician saying K2, K3. What you need to worry about is that last kind of sentence. The specific K level is not required in the treating physician's medical record. Information supporting the K level must be present. The picture, the story supporting what the patient is expected to be able to do is what they're looking for in the medical record, not the physician rewriting the definition of K2 or K3. Now, I heard some frustration, and I totally understand that, working in this industry for 20 years, about physicians not documenting and really the frustration there. I cannot express how much I rely on working with physical therapists with the physician. Physical therapists are trained from the get-go on documenting detail. That's what they document. They document observations and measurements in detail. I always recommend, if you have a physician that is a struggle to get good documentation out of, to ask them to work with a physical therapist, because usually between the physical therapist and then the physician records, that physical therapist can provide more of those details, more of that background. And we've been very successful working with Medicare, the clients I've worked with, that they'll consider both of that information, because the physical therapy records are part of the medical record. And even in the draft LCD, for the draft change to the lower limb prosthesis, there was mention in there, very similar to the power wheelchair policy, on being able to use physical therapy notes. So physical therapists are generally very open to having a discussion with you on what needs to be evaluated, what needs to be documented. Physicians are generally very open on working with physical therapists. They work with them a lot on different, all different types of matters. So I have found this to be a very successful way to help support weaker physician records. And so I'd recommend that that be something you consider. So when I put it all together, this is how I kind of look at it. The physician paints the picture. The physician and the medical records supply that objective information. And then you guys get to come in and say, corroborating the physician's story based upon this picture of the patient, here's the componentry that's necessary. And these items up here are the items from the LCD and the article that really direct the types of information they want to see in the story. What is the medical history of the patient? That they did a physical examination. What is that amputation history? And we get to K-level justification. That doesn't mean writing K2, K3. It means talking about what they did before the amputation, what they're expected to do after the amputation, painting that picture. Now, I've spent over half my time here speaking on prosthesis, and I'm going to talk a little bit about orthosis because Brian's going to come up and give you guys some really good takeaway hints on the types of specific things you can use to document that picture and to tell that story. But for an orthosis, it's a little bit different. Here, we need medical records to paint the picture and explain why the patient needs the brace, the orthosis. But then based upon the type of orthosis you provide, different people have to provide different types of documentation. If you're doing custom fit, that comes from you. If you're doing custom fabricated, that needs to come from the physician and you. And this is the one area that I do believe we may, keep our fingers crossed, see CMS really have some changes to how the records are reviewed with the recent law that went into place that states that your records are now considered part of the medical record. Because unlike the LCD for lower limb prosthesis, where it specifically says the physician has to document something, when it comes to the underlying need of the brace, the LCD here just says the medical record needs to support. So I'm hoping we're going to see the ability to use our records as this gets implemented to help support the brace. With that said, the LCD does say, the LCD and the policy article do say, for custom fabrication, that has to come from the physician. So there is one instance in the LCD where it specifically references that the physician has to document it. But in the underlying base medical necessity, it just says medical record. So this may be an area where we really do see some relief and changes once we see how they're going to actually implement it. I put together a slide here that just basically goes over the types of custom fabrication reasons. For AFOs and KFOs, there's 5 specific bases for providing a custom fabricated AFO or KFO. The physician's records need to support one of those 5 reasons. When it comes to your knee and spinal braces, there's not a specific list of reasons as to why custom fabrication would be required. Rather, they talk about the physical characteristics of the patient. And so it is a little bit more open-ended there, I think. But you need to make sure that the physician's records do explain why we're providing custom fabricated orthosis versus an off-the-shelf orthosis. When it's an off-the-shelf orthosis, then it comes down to you. If you're going to take that off the shelf and make it custom fit, then your records need to explain that. But the physician's records do need to have, if you're going to do custom fabricated, depending on the category, they need to address at least one of these things, one of those bullets. So putting it all together, I used to use that bottom chart a lot. And people continually, I think, view it this way, that off the shelf, the MD documents the medical need for the orthosis. And then if we go to custom fit, we have to have that, and then we have the orthotist documents the reason for the custom fit orthosis. And then for custom fabricated, we have to have the corroboration between you and the physician explaining why it is custom fabricated. I'd like to point something out, though. Oops, and I see that I said Medicare record instead of medical record. Sorry about that. The medical record, not necessarily the MD, is what supports the underlying need for the orthosis. So watch for the guidance that comes out once CMS implements it. This really could be an area where we can use our documents very differently than we're using them now, but we're going to have to wait to see exactly how the DME MACs are told to implement and interpret the guidance. But as you move from off the shelf all the way over to custom fabricated, as we would expect, the amount of documentation you need essentially increases. So off the shelf, we just need the base understanding and meeting those guidelines in the LCD and article. When you get over to custom fitted, we need that plus your documentation, and then custom fabricated, that plus yours plus the physicians explaining the custom basis for the custom. So I did put a slide in here about who's responsible for documenting medical necessity for custom versus prefabricated. I get asked that a lot, and again, as much as I would hope maybe you would believe what I say, I want to give you the FAQs that show you exactly how the DME MACs interpret it and where it's coming from, which is the LCD itself specifically says there must be detailed documentation in the treating physician's record to support the medical necessity of a custom fabricated versus prefabricated. And then for AFOs, I think, and it's important too, because if you just read the LCD and don't read the policy article, sometimes you'll miss very important pieces of information. As you read just the LCD, sometimes it's not as clear of what needs to be done by the physician versus you. When you go into that policy article, it really does spell it out. And so here's the language from the policy article on a question is, where in the AFO LCD does it reference the need in the medical record for physicians to document why? And the FAQ answer was word for word from the LCD. For custom fabricated orthosis, there must be detailed documentation in the treating physician's record to support the medical necessity. It must be corroborated by the functional evaluation of the orthotist or prosthetist records. So the policy article and the LCD show that you have to do both of that if you're going to do custom fabricated. So kind of to pull this back together again, as much as I get up here and I say, remember, it's a contract between the insurance company and the patient. Medicare is a contract between Medicare Trust Fund and the patient, the beneficiary. In order for us to help the patient meet the contractual obligations to ensure payment, we need the physician to explain the why behind their decision, their medical treatment decisions. And if we can get the physician to kind of move out of the mind frame of, I wrote a script for it, they should provide it, to the mind frame of, here's why I wrote the script. And as kind of, paint the picture. I know I've said it a bunch of times, and I feel like a broken record when I say that. That's truly what we're looking for, is the story, the picture, the history of the patient, and the expectations of the patient. If we can get that information in the medical record, I guarantee you're going to see a lot more coverage than you do when the physician just says K3 ambulator. So please, for our patients, as much as it is a struggle for us, they're the ones sitting waiting, and they're the ones not being able to get care. And if we can get the ear of the physician and maybe just start with that phrase of, we need you to paint the picture, we need you to tell the story, and take it out of the clinical perspective and tell the story that, the example, construction worker. Tell the story that he's a construction worker, so he wants to return back to work. He's going to be walking on, construction sites. That's a whole different story than he is a K3 ambulator, period. And so that's what I think, if we can get there, we'll be all right. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
It's me again, problem child. Maybe we could convince the physicians to be more involved if their payments were withheld until they explained why that patient they just did an amputation on needs a prosthetic leg.
I don't disagree, and I will tell you there's actually in CMS regulations that, like, when you seek to get medical records, if a physician doesn't provide you medical records, there is some regulations out there that allow CMS to come in, and I think it says they can audit the physician. I'm not sure I've seen them really do that, but I agree. Unfortunately, we're in a team with the physicians, but the physician doesn't have any downside. We have the downside.
Right. The responsibility gets put on us.
No, I
Sorry.
No, I'm actually, I support you, agree with you, I just don't have a solution, sorry.
No, you're not. You keep talking about painting a picture of, history with a patient. For example, a lot of our patients are low income, Medicare, Medicaid. They go to a university medical center, they see a doctor one time, see another doctor a different time, go to the free clinic. Do you have any suggestions on how to paint a picture when these people, they don't have transportation, they don't have the resources to go to these physicians to get this quality care for a physician that maybe cares enough to paint a picture? I mean, they're going to student doctors and things like that where they're just, patient had an amputation and that's all that they know. So I mean, what can you suggest for something like that? And that's unfortunately a majority of our patient base is that kind of patient.
And that's a hard situation. I'll tell you what we've done at Ability is we do these things that we call them reach to teach calls. And it is where myself, the CEO, and the clinician that's involved will get on the phone with the patient. And we will provide, usually they take about half an hour, and we'll do education on the insurance process, talk about their specific care and what their insurance policy requires. And then we give an ask to them on, here are the things you need to do. And a lot of times in those scenarios, it is here are the things when you meet with your physician, you need to be firm about, I need to talk to you about these things, and you please need to add them to your medical record. And we'll then follow up that call with something in writing to the patient. We've been doing that over the last, 6 to 9 months, I would say, as a true program. And we've seen a lot of success once we talk to the patient about being their own advocate, because it's very hard for us to be an advocate for a patient that doesn't want to take the time to be their own advocate. So, and a lot of the patients, it's not that they don't want to be an advocate, they didn't know they needed to be one, and they didn't know how to be one. So we've taken a step of trying to educate the patient and putting some of this back in the patient's hands, and even giving them little pieces of paper that are in colored paper that say, here are the 3 things I need to make sure when I sit with my physician, this is, they can hand it to the physician saying, we have to get this in for me to have this covered. I don't have the answer in all situations. I can just tell you that's something we're trying, and we're seeing success. Obviously not 100%, but much more success giving that information to the patient and letting them be their own advocate.
I just feel like the patients are the ones being penalized because they don't have the resources, and some of these requirements are truly unreasonable, and they're not realistic for certain situations, and it's just a shame that the patient has to be the one to suffer.
Yeah. All right, do we have one more question? Okay, and then Brian, is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't believe anybody in this room is inventing the need. The need is out there, it's everywhere. The problem is, how do we garnish all that information and communicate it to the payer? I think the problem is we rely more on software, that the physicians are relying on software. So I think the problem is with the software, it's not with us. If they had certain fields that they had to fill out when they prescribe an AFO, it would cue them to what they need to put in it. And remember, these doctors are seeing 60 people a day on the average. The ones that are on capitation, maybe even more. If you focus on the software, you're dealing with only a few companies. If these companies could be maybe licensed to provide, if they're billing Medicare, I'm sure there's some kind of license that they require. Isn't there something that they require if you're billing Medicare to the software, or there's got to be a, I think that's where the choke point is, and that's the easiest place to fix this, is where with the software writers and say, okay, if they prescribe an AFO, this is what we need. If they prescribe a leg, this is what's got to be in it. And it'd be a simple thing, and this problem would be over. It wouldn't be continuing, and we wouldn't have to reinvent the wheel with each patient. It would just happen. Because the need is out there, the information is out there, everybody has a history, we just can't communicate it. You know?
And I don't disagree with you. I think the real issue is that when you look at things, we are a small population of the DME. The software companies have come around when it comes to oxygen, CPAP, some of the wheelchairs and things that you're seeing them put in templated charting in the sense that it walks the physician through the right questions to ask before they discharge the patient for a certain type of DME. I think that's a wonderful idea if we could get with the software companies and help educate them. I warn against checkmark templates. But if it walked them through the questions and gave them the ability to, like they can right now, narratively answer certain questions, combined with some check marks, I think it would be great. We've seen good success of that in other areas. I've had a few clients that have had success where they've worked with a large hospital-based physicians, and the physicians have said to the hospital, get the IT people to understand what types of things are needed in the medical record and give me fields to put that in. And they've worked one-on-one with like that hospital group. But as an industry, going to the software vendors and helping them understand what we need from the physicians, the EMR vendors, I would be 100% behind that and support that. And I think that's a wonderful solution. We just got to get, we just don't have the numbers behind us that we have physicians asking for it. Whereas with oxygen and those types of things, they didn't. Yep.
Great comment. So join me in thanking Stephanie for her presentation. My name is Brian Califf. I'm the Clinical Outcome and Research Director at Ability, but I'm also a certified prosthetist. And so to me, documentation isn't the funnest thing to think about. I like to think about cool activities my patients do, or unique treatments, alignment of prostheses, component function. But in reality, this is an area where we can make a huge improvement in our processes and to benefit our patients. So I kind of started off with the thought, why the clinical notes we write often fail to support insurance coverage for the patient's device. Follow a documentation strategy or process to allow the patient to address the patient, prosthesis, and the policy. So I kind of want to make it simpler instead of more complicated generally, because I understand as busy practitioners to take time out of the day and review a policy article, an LCD, you may not have the time to do that. So what you need to do is to develop habits and processes and documentation really approaches that are going to routinely help you and your referring physicians, physical therapists, occupational therapists to ensure that what they're spending time writing or dictating does satisfy these requirements. So I have kind of an outline. I'm trying to get through as much as I can in the remaining time. So I'll just get kind of into it. So first thing to recognize is that this quote, beauty is always in the eye of the beholder, right? Well, in healthcare, we have to understand that value is in the eye of the beholder. And we have to remember who the consumer is. The patient is the user of the intervention, but actually the entity that decides if it's valuable and worthy of payment is usually the insurance company, because they're the ones that are dictating whether or not it will be covered. So value is in the eye of the beholder, so we need to keep that in mind, that we have to have documentation processes to communicate the value of our interventions to the nurse case reviewers who are reading our notes and our referral physician notes. Because in reality, those nurse case reviewers, medical directors, they're never going to see the intervention. They're only ever going to see what's written down in the clinical records. So we've seen throughout the talk today quotes of some frequent error rates or frequent denial rates. So these are some outdated statistics, but I just wanted to focus in bold the reasons why some of these resulted in RAC audits was 20% were missing information about the patient regarding their functional level. So if you miss out in documenting something about the patient, you can lose an audit. Or if you, one of the other reasons was no reason for replacement of the prosthesis, and we talked about maybe some also for need for the replacement of an orthosis. So if you're not addressing the device, whether it's a prosthesis or an orthosis, that's another reason for high denial rates, audit rates. So one thing that we can advocate for, and I'm going to recommend to you, is to adopt things that other specialists do routinely to ensure that they do a great job at some critical point. So if any of you have worked in ORs or around surgeries, you know that the surgeon or the anesthesiologist calls a timeout at some point before they operate. And that's to make sure that they don't do the operation on the wrong leg. That's to make sure that they have a plan in place and that they have the right personnel there before they go ahead and start an incision, okay? So if documentation and insurance coverage is such an important endpoint here, we should be calling a timeout before we send to bill. At that point, after that, it's going to be almost too late to address any of these missing components. So calling a timeout at that point by the practitioner should lead this effort just like the surgeon calls the timeout. The practitioner should call a billing timeout before it's sent to bill and ensure that all the requirements are met. And something that you can use to assist this is a checklist. Another thing surgeons use, they have a checklist of all of their surgical implements to make sure that they don't forget one inside the body cavity. It's also something that commercial airline pilots implemented so that they would ensure that they had the right flight plan before they took off the ground. So this is a good idea, and there's an available checklist for lower limb prosthetics that I find super useful, and it's a checklist for you as a provider to ensure that you satisfy these documentation requirements. And you can Google it. I think it's called checklist, LCD, lower limb prosthetics, and you'll find it in the first couple of hits. Otherwise, here's the website, and it's in my references as well. So I like to keep things simple and things we can easily remember as we're dictating our notes and seeing our patients. And so I'm starting to talk about something as simple as the 3 Ps when I talk about documentation. You have to address the patient, the prosthesis, and the policy. Okay? Missing any one of those could result in inadequate documentation. In orthoses, it's even funner because it's POP, right? And that can be easy to remember. So we saw some denial rates or denial reasons if we're not addressing the patient adequately in our documentation. So quantifiable and comprehensive evaluation of the domains relevant to the intervention. So we'll get into some of these more specifics, but we want to address the patient in our notes. Sometimes I can read prosthetist notes and they go in great detail about the intervention, but they don't mention much about the patient. And we can see why we know why that's important. The prosthesis or the orthosis, whether it's commercial payers or Medicare, a lot of times certain components end up being what's denied. And that may lead to the whole claim being denied, but it's based on one specific component. And the reason for denial is that there's not adequate justification that that specific component is necessary. So that's why the prosthesis, addressing the prosthesis in great detail in our documentation is important, listing out why each component is necessary for that patient. And then I say that the last P is the policy, is to be familiar. It's easy to be familiar with Medicare's policies because we see so many more patients. It's sometimes more difficult with private insurance companies because they have very specific policies and they're unique to each patient's plan sometimes. But when we're dealing with lower limb prostheses or custom orthoses, it's worth the time and effort to get a hold of that policy and review what it says, because it may have specific requirements over and above Medicare's general requirements that you're going to want to address and work with your physicians to address in the medical record. So again, this is just copy and paste of the LCD policy for lower limb prostheses, which I hope we're all familiar with, that we have to make sure there's documentation that a patient will reach or maintain a defined functional state, which we understand to be a functional level or a K level, within a reasonable period of time, and that they're motivated to ambulate. So these are the requirements. But again, that LCD is a couple pages long, and we want to try to simplify things and make it easier to remember and have this process that we and our physicians can use. So I invented these kind of Mad Libs, documentation Mad Libs, or the who, what, where, when, whys. I don't know how we want to talk about it, but remembering these couple bullet points and ensuring to document those on each and every patient, I think will help. So in the blanks, I have just here component assistive function, right? Because that's what we provide. We provide assistive devices in the way of orthoses and prostheses. And different design criteria have specific assistive functions. So that component assistive function, you can drop anything you want in there. You can drop microprocessor knee, you can drop custom custom AFO. And if you address these in your documentation, we're going to have a better chance of having the right justification in there. So who needs this component assistive function? Addressing the patient in great detail. What is this component assistive function? Sometimes just describing what it is in your clinical note can help you on the way to good documentation. When, during that patient's ADLs, vocational or avocational activities, do they actually even need this component assistive function? Then the prosthetist and orthotist can do the best job at this second to last one. How will that component assistive function address a specific functional deficit that patient's faced with? And then I think the last one's really cool. Just thinking about this, and this helps to explain it into maybe a nurse case reviewer who isn't as familiar with some of the specific technologies or specific interventions that we work with. What if they don't receive this component assistive function? What can we reasonably expect to happen? So we can fill in the blanks with lower limb prostheses, right? Who needs a microprocessor knee? It's Mrs. Smith needs this microprocessor knee. She suffered a transfemoral. I think knees are microprocessor knee for transfemoral, right? I should get that one right. She has suffered a transfemoral amputation 2 years ago. You get into about the patient, their prior functional level and their expected functional level. You can address things, call out things that you've seen in the physician's note about other maybe lack of comorbidities, so you can reasonably expect for them to regain their prior amputation functional level. What is a microprocessor knee? Describing what it is. It has a computer that steers a hydraulic cylinder to provide an increased stability in stance, phase, and gait and balance. When during Mrs. Smith's ADLs, well, I guess in my mind, she might be Medicare age, right? So maybe she has to do some of her own grocery shopping where she has to ambulate independently in the community would be a good one. How will the microprocessor knee address a specific functional deficit? So maybe she has a shorter limb length and wouldn't have the the drive and hip extension to control a free swinging knee or otherwise a hydraulic knee, and so the microprocessor is needed for an increased stability. And then what if they don't receive it? So if Miss Smith doesn't receive a microprocessor knee, she may have lower balance confidence. She may self-limit her own activities, and she may suffer a fall, which she could have a hip fracture. So having a prosthesis that's more stable with the microprocessor knee would benefit her in that way. We could take the same approach and the same Mad Lib to custom AFOs. I think Stephanie did a great job talking about some of the specific requirements, as well as our colleagues from the contractors, about custom AFOs and the detailed documentation that we need for that. So who needs it? You could talk about your patient that suffered a stroke and they have been discharged from rehabilitation and their dorsiflexors have not returned, and they continue to present with foot drop. And the patient is expected to continue to suffer from foot drop for an extended period of time. So that long-standing need you can describe in great detail about their condition. What is a custom AFO? You can just briefly describe that in your note. We all know what it is. When during their ADLs, so that could be used for all ambulatory tasks, including household and outside of the household activities, so anytime that the patient's up and walking. How will that component-assisted function, how will that custom AFO address the specific functional deficit? The custom AFO increases toe clearance by addressing the foot drop. And then what if they don't receive the custom AFO? Then at this point, I would look at addressing what if they receive a prefabricated AFO, right? Or a custom fit AFO as opposed to a custom fabricated AFO. So you can think of some of the reasons why those less custom devices wouldn't suit her needs. And in doing that, you in combination with the physician's record and interrogating the record, are going to likely address some of the LCD requirements for custom AFOs. So, take some Mad Libs back home to your practice. You can take these empty slides and, laminate them and stick them to every exam room door. And as you leave, you're going to cue yourself with some of these. So everyone at this point is addressed who should document towards these requirements. Should it be in the prosthetist-orthotist note? What needs to be in the prosthetist-orthotist note? And what needs to be in the physician's note? I think everyone's been pretty clear about what needs to be in the physician's note as the current law stands, while the prosthetist, orthotist, or physical therapist or other allied healthcare providers can augment that or corroborate that with additional information. But for me, everything has to be in the prosthetist, orthotist note, including the requirements that the physician will need. Because if you address all of the documentation requirements in your note and you share that with your physician, it's going to start to train them in what's necessary, and you're going to create practice habits within their own documentation processes. So if you cover all of the requirements in your own record, share those with your physician as you're co-treating patients, they're going to actually learn by doing or learn by reviewing your records. So that's I wanted to keep documentation simple. People use SOAP notes, some people do H&P, some people are doing SOGAP, some people have EMRs, some people have paper charts. So I wanted to be really agnostic to however we're recording our medical records as prosthetist, orthotist. And I hope that some of those points are helpful. I wanted to take some time as well to address some topics that I'm interested in, and most people who are concerned with improving their documentation are also usually interested in. So I want to talk about outcome measures, big data, and healthcare economics, because some of these topics are also going to become even more relevant when we talk about documentation and coverage. So outcome measures, right? These are tests, either surveys or performance tests, that can quantify a domain that's not readily observable. So the idea of health-related quality of life. You can't really use your prosthetic eye and then quantify the patient's health-related quality of life too well. But there's validated instruments, survey instruments, that can get you to a number. So outcome measures are typically used to evaluate, discriminate, or predict some type of phenomenon with your patient. They need to be consistently used, and they need to be objective type of outcome measures to enhance your patient evaluation. And those are some of the benefits that outcome measures bring. Because if you're using the same, say, patient-reported outcome measure or survey, every time you see your patient, or with every patient that you see, they're going to be confronted with the same set of questions. And so that creates a level of consistency within your practice. And then you're relying also less on your own clinical judgment that's informed just through your experiences, but you have that objective information from a survey or from a performance test upon which you can interpret. Outcome measures to me are great for being better at identifying and documenting the individual patient deficits or limitations. So our patients with stroke all present to us very differently. Our patients with lower limb amputation in their home environment all are faced with different environmental barriers. So we can't just blanket say that people all have the same deficits. So outcome measures can help us to uncover some of these deficits that we otherwise wouldn't have learned about if we didn't administer a survey or administer some type of performance test. Outcome measures for us are great for monitoring improvement with the intervention. So if you take them pre and post, your documentation can tell or paint the story in a very objective way that they've increased, say, 20% in some type of domain, which I'm sure nurse case reviewers would love to see that level of information. So, we also find it's great for engaging and informing our patients of their current functional status. This type of engagement actually can help motivate the patient. When they become aware with a number of their deficits, they become focused on it. And inherently, we all want to improve any number we're assigned. That's why we do standardized testing in schools to help students and their families understand that they need to improve. So by just informing our patients where they're at in a spectrum with some type of outcome measure, you're getting that engagement around that domain. Say we're focused on balance. Ma'am, you have a balance deficit. You're in the lower 50% of patients with this scale. Are you motivated to improve your balance? Things like that. It's great for interdisciplinary communication because a lot of times different providers use different words that mean the same thing. But an outcome measure score tells a lot about the patient, especially if they're familiar with it. If I tell a physical therapist that someone has an activity-specific balance confidence score of 50, most physical therapists around the country are going to know exactly what that represents as far as that patient's balance confidence. Then it provides practices an opportunity to aggregate data and benchmark and track trends, which can really help you to know if your patients are underperforming or if patients are doing perfectly well with their interventions. Underperformers, you would want to refer for maybe some outside help from a physical therapist, or change the intervention because they're underperforming what you would expect them to do, say with a transtibial prosthesis, with an energy storing and returning foot, or a custom AFO. And in that way, it supports continuous quality improvement for your practice, and you're improving the types of domains that you're measuring with outcome measures, not just improving throughput of how many patients you can see in a day, or how many of a certain device you can provide in a quarter. There are pitfalls around outcome measures, and I want to take some time to talk about those a little bit, not too much time. So a lot of times we find that the goals of our treatment goals, there's no outcome measure that's established with validity and reliability to measure that. So a lot of times the outcome measures may not be relevant. For discrimination or deciding if patients fall into known groups like non-fallers and fallers, sometimes for outcome measures there's no established cut score. So a cut score, it would be like for the ABC, 67% is a fall risk cutoff score. So in that scale, it's 0 to 100. If somebody has 68% or higher balance confidence, then it doesn't predict that they're at risk of falls. But if they have a lower than 67, then it predicts that they're at risk of falls. But not all outcome measures have this type of cut score established in research, so it may not be as useful. Other pitfalls, and as clinicians, we get excited about recording outcome measures, but it really deflates our bubble when we see our patients sometimes diminish or stay plateaued with some of the outcome measure results. And it shouldn't be discouraging because some of our patients have these long-standing needs, and we may not expect for them to have wonderful benefits and have improving scores throughout their lives, and even with an intervention that they might need. But maintaining that or decreasing or lessening the decline over time are important treatment goals as well. Some of the barriers in adopting outcome measures are around there's no value added to the patient experience or to the intervention we're making. So for example, administering an outcome measure doesn't really tell you how thick of thermoplastic you need to use to make that custom AFO. I agree, it doesn't. And so when you're in your workflow and treating your patients, outcome measure administration sometimes is deprioritized because of that. So finding a way that administering outcome measures provides a value to that patient experience or that patient encounter can really help address that pitfall. Some EMR or paper charts just are going to be more difficult in implementing outcome measures, recording them, and monitoring them over time. Potential pitfall could be healthcare policy decisions are based on outcome measures or some type of tests that are actually unvalidated or are known or typically used with cut scores, but they're unvalidated. So outcome measure decisions for policies in the future need to be based on good science around psychometric properties of outcome measures. And so that's just a potential pitfall. Say if a certain commercial payer adopt some type of evaluation or assessment or outcome measure, but it's of poorer quality, or the cut scores are really unvalidated or just pulled from thin air, you're going to have patients that are going to have coverage limitations, and it's based off of unfound logic. So this idea of big data, so outcome measures in your documentation, we're thinking, gosh, how many patients do I treat with custom AFOs over the year? We could really get to some big data. But I want to dispel that idea that outcome measurement is research, and refocus your use of outcome measures as better documentation for your individual patient. So if you compare your patient's results to published mean scores for able-bodied populations or populations with certain conditions, it can help you in describing their deficits. Sometimes you can tell which percentile the patient falls into, or like I say, compare them to those cut scores. It's important, if you're using outcome measures in your documentation, for your organization to have a strategic vision and not just go willy-nilly picking outcome measures anytime you feel, because you really never stick to that, and you don't produce these great habits about including documentation results in the rationale for your documentation. You need to reinforce these habits if you want to have routine data collection. Because one thing we know and we can see are some trends for the Medicare Quality Payment Program, which if you're not familiar with that, if you Google that, Medicare Quality Payment Program, you can learn about, and it's not too detailed, they have some great summaries, but it's all about this idea that providers, initially physicians, nurse practitioners, PAs and things, are now required or going to be required to submit quality measures along with their documentation records to receive payment, and they'll either have a positive adjustment or a negative adjustment on their reimbursement based on their quality measures scores that they turn in. So big data can result in some retrospective chart reviews. We've had experience with our own records. We've published some of our average data for lower limb amputees, for cranial remolding outcomes. We've presented on those. So we think that's a real value and big benefit of using outcome measures. We've also been able to share our data in a de-identified manner with research institutions who've created some cool predictive modeling based on our retrospective data, which further informs us on how we're using outcome measures to make decisions. So I'm over time, and I could talk forever about healthcare economics, and I'm just going to stop for there. There was a recent State of Science conference on healthcare economic science, and there will be a proceedings journal that will come from that that will be extremely informative for our profession on how healthcare economic science can benefit our patients' access to lower limb, upper limb, and otherwise prosthetic and orthotic interventions. So here's my references, and I want to thank you all for attending this documentation best practices organized session, and I especially want to thank our speakers for coming and sharing their expertise. And we do still have time for some questions, but please join me again in thanking our speakers tonight.